Hello, Becca.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me? I'm using a headset today.
I sure can. Yeah. Can you see the slide deck on my screen?
I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hmm.
Mark, just to give you a heads up, I gave you a just sent you a quick email to you and Joel. Bob won't be joining us this meeting, so I just want to
Okay.
flag that
Yeah,
for
I know.
you.
Yeah, I know that he was trying,
Yes.
but yeah, thank you for the heads up that
Yes.
we're on deck.
Yeah, sounds good. And thank you to our attendees who are on so far. We will wait promptly until noon just to make sure that folks can join us. Appreciate you
Sure.
being here.
You bet.
Hi, Becca. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect. Thanks, Sarah.
Great, thanks. Is my audio okay in terms of
Yes, you
clarity?
sound great.
Okay,
Sounds all good.
very good.
Mhm.
Okay,
Perfect.
thank you.
Absolutely. And just a heads up, Sarah, I just sent you a quick email. Bob is unable to attend today. So we will have Mark or Joel step in for his portion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. And for all of our attendees that are on the line, thanks for being here. We will start promptly at noon. Appreciate it. Hi, Katie. Hi, Joel. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, sure can.
Awesome. And Joel, just confirming that you are covering for Bob, correct?
Yes, I'm just reading his bullet points, right?
Awesome. Yep, that's correct.
I can handle that.
Fabulous. Thanks, Joel. Katie, can you hear me okay?
I can. Thanks, Becca. Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Perfect. Yep.
Hello, everyone. Thanks to all of our attendees who have hopped on so far. We are going to start promptly at noon or maybe a minute after just to make sure everybody can get settled in. So thanks so much for being here. Hi, everybody. Thanks to everyone who's just hopped on. We're going to wait another maybe minute, 2 minutes or so that everybody can hop on at noon, and then we will start promptly. Thanks so much for being here. Okay, good afternoon. It is now 12:01, and just to be respectful of everyone's time, I will go ahead and get started. Certainly, I expect we'll have some folks joining us that can just hop in at any point. So thank you so much in advance for your time. We really appreciate you all joining us on this cold last day of November. I hope you're all doing well. Just to orient you, this is a virtual open house for the US 93 Missoula to Florence corridor study. A couple of my counterparts with MDT and RPA will be doing a presentation here for you all. And then the end of the session will be questions and answers, just to kind of orient you as to what we're doing this afternoon. My name is Becca. I am with Big Sky Public Relations and work on behalf of both the Montana Department of Transportation and Robert Pecha and Associates to help facilitate communication on this project. Sarah Nicolai with RPA is the project manager from the engineering firm, so she will be taking on the bulk of this presentation with myself, as well as Joel Boucher with MDT. So you'll be hearing a lot from both of us. We also have the greater project team representatives included here, again, from RPA and MDT, here to assist in answering any questions you have and just really give a thorough update on where we're at with the study. And last but certainly not least, my colleague at Big Sky Public Relations, Katie Hodge, is on the call as well. She will kindly help us facilitate the question and answer session at the end of our presentation. To that end, if you have a question at any time, feel free to write it in the Q&A section of your Zoom channel. So it's just to clarify, it's not the chat, it's the Q&A chat box. You're welcome to pop in a question there at any point during the presentation, or you're welcome to wait until the end. And we'll go through as many of those as we can within our time today. If for some reason we hit our hour and a half or so we have together and we are not able to answer your question, we can certainly follow up with you via email and make sure those are addressed. So with that, I will go to our next slide here to chat through what we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk a little bit about background of the study in case this is brand new to you. We're going to highlight both study findings and identified potential solution concepts. We're going to be speaking through quite a bit of information and data to share with you. And again, after the presentation, we are really interested in hearing your thoughts and answering your questions. Our main priority here is truly to gather your feedback on the study and this menu of solutions that we'll discuss here this afternoon. So with that, I will pause and pass it to Joel to speak with you briefly about Vision Zero.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joel Boucher with the Department of Transportation, and I'm sure, as you're all well aware, traffic volumes have increased throughout the Missoula and Bitterroot areas. There is much need for roadway improvements through this corridor, and MDT is currently determining a solution that incorporates feedback from the public at this time and will benefit the area for many years to come. MDT has enlisted the consultants RPA to assist with this study. As many of you are familiar with, Vision Zero is a multi-pronged initiative with the ultimate goal of eliminating deaths and injuries on Montana's highways. Without good roads, bridges, and intersections, traveling safely and efficiently through Montana would be very difficult. Having roads, bridges, and other transportation systems and educated drivers on how to use them is critical to building strong communities and a strong state. Excuse me. As you see on the slide, Vision Zero is made up of 4 components: education, enforcement, engineering, and emergency medical response. These elements help guide our initiatives and roadway projects to ensure they are as safe as possible. MDT asks all drivers to do their part by slowing down, by paying attention, wearing their seatbelts, and not driving impaired. Our goal is always for travelers to get to their destination safe. As a highly traveled roadway in the Bitterroot Valley, this project must align with our Vision Zero goal, and we strongly believe that this project will allow us to better achieve that goal.
Thank you, Joel. I appreciate it. With that, I will now guide us back to speaking specifically about the study. I want to speak to the study area, and some of you might be familiar with this, but if not, just a little bit of a recap. The project area we're speaking to today, really in depth, is this blue line you'll see here on the map. From Missoula to Florence, beginning at the Bitterroot River Bridge at Missoula city limits, and then ending at the first stoplight as you enter Florence. There was also a speed study from Missoula to Hamilton here in orange, as you'll see, that was recently completed. The speed study was completed separately from this corridor study, but actually up front here, just in a moment, I'll be touching on this information, so that's available to you, as of course it's quite relevant to what we're speaking to today, and you can have the opportunity to comment on those results as well. And lastly, indicated on the map, there is a mill and fill project taking place in 2024 from Missoula to Lolo. That's indicated in this yellow dashed line at the top of your screen. Again, these three are completely separate, but just wanted to flag that there's quite a bit happening in the corridor, just so you're kind of aware and we can orient you, since we'll be touching on a couple of these things this afternoon. So to that end, I'm going to speak just for a moment about the speed study that was completed separately from the corridor study. The Montana Department of Transportation, in partnership with KLJ Engineering, again, recently completed a speed study from Missoula to Hamilton in response to a request from Missoula County to consider lowering speed limits. There were 5 study segments between Missoula to Hamilton, as you'll see listed on the bottom left-hand of your screen, Lolo to Missoula, Florence to Missoula, and so on. That's just how they portioned out the segments of the study. Methodology for the study included consideration of things like roadway conditions and characteristics. This includes lane and shoulder widths, pavement type and condition, rumble strips, various access points, vertical grades, adjacent development, traffic control, things of this nature. In addition, vehicular types and classes were taken into account as well. So the study team took a look at different types of vehicles, motorcycles, passenger vehicles, pickup trucks, vans, buses, delivery trucks, large trucks with multiple axles. They also looked at the number and severity of crashes and citation history. And last, and of course, not least, they looked at speed characteristics and spot speed data. In terms of timeline for when this data was gathered, road characteristics were collected during a field visit in August of 2022. Vehicle class data was collected between August and September of 2022. Crash history and citation data was reviewed from a longer period between January of 2016 through the end of 2020. And lastly, spot speed data was collected in August and September of 2022 as well. So that's just a little bit of logistics and background on the speed study, how it was conducted, when. And here on the screen, I also have a link to the greater, much more detailed PDF of the speed study results. This presentation and recording will be posted on the project webpage, so you will certainly have access to that link as well if that interests you to dig deeper into that. So with that, I am going to quickly dive into speed study findings and recommendations that came out of that study. So the current posted speeds, again, between Missoula and Hamilton, are at the 50th percentile, which means that half of drivers are traveling above and the other half are traveling below the speed limit. The 50th percentile might be appropriate for developed areas or when roadway conditions are not super favorable for all users. The 85th percentile is typically used to set speed limits when roadway conditions are favorable. And typically that 85th percentile marker is used as a starting point for setting that limit, is considered to be the maximum safe speed for a location. Changing a speed limit does not automatically make an area safer per se. Drivers will typically drive the speed limit they feel most comfortable with within a given environment. Enhancing roadway safety features in the corridor that Sarah will be touching on here momentarily. Things like including intersection improvements, lighting, pavement markings, reducing conflicts in other ways is something that was recommended via this speed study as well. And again, some of this is being identified via the corridor study that we'll touch on in a second. And lastly, I want to note also that the study found that drivers have a real difficulty slowing down when transitioning to developed areas. So for example, coming into Missoula, coming into Lolo, there's a real challenge with that speed differential and approaching those more urban areas. So lastly, on this slide, I want to note on the recommendations based on those findings. There was no recommended change to the holistic speed limit on US 93. However, the existing 55 mile per hour transition speed zones should be extended to half a mile in total. And then a new 55 mile per hour transition speed zone should be introduced between what currently exists as a 65 mile per hour and 45 mile per hour area south of Missoula. And lastly, that traffic calming devices should be considered, such as urban transition zones, things like speed, feedback, or warning signs, items of this nature. So with that, switching gears a little bit here, I'm going to pass it to Sarah Nicolai with RPA. She is going to speak more in depth to the US 93 Missoula to Florence corridor study. So I'll pass it to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Becca, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all again for joining us for this presentation. So as Becca mentioned, I'm going to switch gears and talk about our ongoing corridor study. And the first slide here that I wanted to touch on is just our overall study process and the status of our study. So we're illustrating the study process as a series of 6 different steps. And step 1 of our process was to analyze traffic and safety and environmental data in the corridor. And you may have seen us out in the field. We were out last summer and again this summer collecting traffic data and environmental data. And we've also been evaluating crash data as well. Also this fall, we actually conducted some supplemental data collection at the school locations. We wanted to make sure that we were capturing the conditions at the new Lolo school. So we are considering step 1 to be completed in our process. Step 2 then is to identify key issues and concerns. And so we were certainly referring back to all of that data that we collected, but we also conducted a round of stakeholder and public listening sessions last year. And then we're doing that again this year to hear from users of the corridor. And that feedback is really valuable to us. We see kind of a snapshot from our data collection, but it's so valuable to hear from folks that drive the corridor every single day. So that has really helped us identify some of the key issues, and we are considering that step complete as well. So currently we are focused on step 3, which is to identify an initial set of broad improvement strategies. And I'll be talking a little bit more about those later in the presentation. But basically we're taking all of that data and the public feedback that we've received, and we're trying to identify some kind of broad strategies that might be a good fit for this corridor. As a next step then will be identifying and evaluating specific improvement concepts for individual locations within the corridor. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a couple of upcoming slides here. I'll just note too that in upcoming steps, we will have additional opportunity for public and stakeholder outreach. So we are planning to come back out again, probably spring, summertime of next year, and we'll have more information to share at that point in terms of recommendations from our study. So next up, I wanted to touch on some of the public and stakeholder feedback that we've heard so far. And I would definitely say that there are a number of common themes that we're hearing in some of the comments that we've received. So I'll touch on a couple of those. First of all, there's definitely concern about increasing traffic volumes due to future growth and development in the area. And I think we've heard from a lot of folks that the corridor has changed a lot in the past 20 years, for example, just as continued development occurs. And just recognizing that the corridor is highly used by students and school buses and commuters and trucks. A lot of folks travel on this corridor, and there's concern about what that future growth and development might mean for traffic volumes. We've heard a lot of concern too about speeds, and Becca touched on that a little bit in terms of the speed study that's been conducted in the corridor. The other point I wanted to note is the speed differential that is sometimes concerning. So we've got pretty high speeds in terms of that main line through traffic as folks are sitting on a side street and trying to make a left turn out onto the roadway or even a right turn. They're starting from a stop position and then having to get up to speed pretty quickly to join that mainline traffic. So there is a speed differential, and that can cause some concerns. I'll touch on some crash and safety data here in a couple of slides, but wanted to acknowledge that a lot of folks are talking about near misses in the corridor, and just acknowledge that our crash and safety data doesn't necessarily capture every single experience out there that's happening that's of concern. So we recognize that and certainly understand that there are near misses occurring that aren't captured in that data. We've heard from folks about conflicts in that center two-way left turn lane where it occurs in the corridor. And of course, that's meant to enable folks to take a left turn from the highway onto an adjacent side street. However, some folks are using that almost more as a staging area. So starting from a side street or an approach, taking a left turn and entering into that center turn lane and using that to accelerate and get up to speed and join the mainline traffic. So that can cause some real conflicts between different types of users and different turning movements. We've heard from a lot of folks too that there is just really steady traffic volumes on this corridor, and there's insufficient gaps in traffic. So as you're waiting on a side street or in a driveway, trying to take a left turn, there just aren't enough gaps in that traffic volume to allow you to safely make a turn. So that's been a concern. We've heard from folks too about nighttime and wintertime conditions where limited lighting or adverse road conditions can really cause concern, and certainly some concern about how that relates to crashes and safety issues in the corridor. In terms of the shared use path, that can cause conflicts too between turning vehicles and pedestrians and bicyclists that are on that path. We've heard from some folks as they're trying to make, say, a right turn onto an approach roadway, if there's a bicyclist or a pedestrian using that trail, they have to slow down and stop and sometimes still, on the highway before they make that turn to make sure that they're not impacting that non-motorized user. The other issue too is that path is located so closely to the roadway, there's just not very much storage area between the path and the highway. In terms of wildlife, this is also a very common comment. We know that deer and elk and bear are even crossing the highway, and a lot of folks have commented that can cause a safety concern. Some people have even observed wildlife that are trapped between that concrete median barrier in the S-curves area and high-speed vehicles on the highway. So just a summary of some of the comments. This is certainly not comprehensive, but these are some of the common themes that we're seeing, hearing again and again from the public. So next up, I want to touch on some of the findings so far. So we wanted to share with you some of the work that we've done and some of the findings that we've identified. And I'll start out first with some traffic information. So those 3 bullets at the top of this slide. We are definitely seeing a very strong commuting pattern in this corridor. So folks that are traveling up north to go to work in Missoula in the morning, and then traveling to the south as they come back home in the evening. And in fact, 65% of our traffic is following that pattern. So pretty strong pattern in this corridor. We are seeing about 3 to 4% of our traffic being heavy trucks, larger trucks, and that's pretty consistent and similar to facilities around the state. So, but important to note that trucks certainly use this corridor as well. In terms of destinations, we know that Missoula is a destination for about 32% of larger trucks. So what that means is that they're more likely to travel regionally to the east or west or farther to the north. And so only 32% of them are stopping in Missoula. By comparison, 72% of our passenger vehicles have Missoula as a destination. So I'm going to switch gears again here and talk about some of our safety findings. Safety is definitely a primary focus of the study, and so wanted to share with you some of the data that we've identified and studied. We looked at a 10-year period for crash data, so 2012 to 2021, and at the time we were starting this investigation, this was the most recently available data from MDT. MDT has a crash database, and it takes them just a little bit to process crash information that's reported from law enforcement and get that into their database and be able to provide it to us. So that's the period we were looking at. And over that 10-year period, we found there were 1,118 crashes that were recorded in the study corridor. So a pretty high number there. Crashes were most often related to wild animals. So in fact, we saw 30% of crashes involved wild animals. We also saw 20% rear end crashes, and those were more common in areas that were more congested. We had about 18% of our crashes involving a fixed object, and a lot of times that was related to that concrete median barrier that I mentioned in the S-curves portion of the corridor, where someone would crash into that barrier. And then 78% of our crashes were in non-junction locations, so meaning not at an intersection, but somewhere along a stretch of highway. A couple more facts we wanted to share with you about crash data. So we did see 41% of our crashes occurring during those commuting hours. So I mentioned the morning and the evening times when people are driving up and down to work. 41% of our crashes occurred then. We had about 54% of our crashes occurring during our winter months, and we considered that from November to February. And of course, then that related to things like adverse road conditions. So if we have snow and slush and ice on the roadway, we were seeing about 32% of crashes occurring under those conditions. A last point here in this column I wanted to mention, so 23% of our crashes did cause injuries, and 4% of those were severe injuries. Now, as it relates to impairment, this was a question that came up in some previous stakeholder conversations. About 7% of crashes involved impairment. However, 35% of our severe crashes involved an impaired driver. So a pretty large percentage there. On the right-hand side, we have a map that is showing the location of where these crashes occurred. And we're using kind of a color-coded heat map. So where you're seeing those yellow and orange colors, that just means there's a concentration of crashes that occurred in those spots. So we are seeing those concentrations around the Lolo area, around the S-curves area, and then as we head farther to the north near Missoula. A lot of crashes happening in those locations. The other thing you'll note too, we have some call-outs. So the red call-outs are fatal crashes, and the blue call-outs are suspected serious injury crashes. So those, of course, are very concerning to us. I will note too, of course, that we recognize that additional crashes have happened since this study period that we looked at. MDT is continuing to incorporate and review that crash data as it comes in. The last thing I'll mention on this slide too is relating to the wild animals. So I mentioned 30% of our crashes involved wild animals. In addition to the crash database, we also looked at MDT's carcass database. And so they keep a database of the carcasses that are picked up along the roadway that have been struck. And during our study period, MDT crews collected 444 animal carcasses. Most of those were deer, but also included elk, bear, mountain lion, and other species. And so we're definitely seeing those wild animal crashes throughout the corridor, but there are some areas where we're seeing some concentrations. So moving on to the next slide, wanted to dig a little bit deeper into our safety analysis. So using all of that crash data that MDT provided to us, we developed what we're calling a safety score, and that involved 3 different components. So first is the crash frequency, and that has to do with the number of crashes that are occurring in a certain spot. So if we think back to that heat map where we're seeing those greater concentrations, those locations would have a higher safety score. It also incorporates crash rate, and so that accounts for exposure to traffic volumes. So areas to the north that have higher traffic volumes, again, would score higher. And then the third component is crash severity. So we were rating crashes that involved in a fatality or a serious injury more highly compared to property damage only crashes. So again, those 3 components went into our safety score. On the right-hand side, then, we are mapping out the locations of those scores. And again, color-coded, we have the orange and red as being the most concerning. So this means the top 10 or top 5% locations by score, where we're seeing the highest numbers. And so we can see a couple of these locations that stand out, predominantly in the northern portion of the corridor. But I did just want to touch through each of these 4 different segments that we have defined for our corridor and talk about some of the safety concerns that we're seeing there. So starting out first at the north end in what we're calling the urban and rural transition area, about half of all of the crashes in that segment were rear end crashes. So I mentioned that rear end crashes happen typically where we're seeing a lot of congestion. So there's a line or a queue of cars and a driver might be distracted or not paying attention and they rear end into the car in front of them. A lot of those crashes were occurring during commute times again, so 39% during our morning and 13% during our evening commute. We did note a trend too that as cars are backing up from the Miller Creek Road area, especially during that morning commute, there are those rear end crashes resulting. And again, it's either drivers following too closely or just being distracted or careless as they're driving. So the next segment I'll touch on is the rural S-curves. So this is the area between Lolo and Missoula. And a lot of these crashes involved fixed objects, so 53%. And again, generally this is folks that are crashing into that concrete median barrier. There are some wild animal conflicts occurring in this portion too, about 12% or so. A lot of these crashes occurred during nighttime when there wasn't any lighting, and adverse road conditions like snow and slush and ice, those were also contributing factors in a lot of these crashes. Becca noted this too, but kind of curve navigation can be really challenging in this area. And a lot of times drivers were driving too fast for conditions. So whether that was the posted speed limit or even a lower speed limit, depending on whether it was snowy or icy. Next up is the Lolo area segment. And again, this is kind of more similar to the northern Missoula area, where we were seeing a high number of rear end crashes. So up to 55% of our crashes here were rear ends. And again, this indicates congestion issues, a lot of traffic and congestion in the Lolo area. Things like roadway condition and lighting and weather were less of a factor in this area, but we were seeing things like failure to yield at right of way, or improperly running a light or making a left turn. Those were things that contributed to some of the severe crashes in that segment. And then lastly, I'll just touch on the rural highway segment at the southern end. We were seeing the highest percentage of wild animal crashes in this portion. So up to 64% of our crashes involved wild animals. A lot of these also occurred during darkness when there wasn't any lighting, so up to 55%. So hopefully that gives you an idea of just some of the conditions that we're seeing out in the corridor and some of the trends and concerns that we've identified. So I'm going to switch gears next and start to talk about some of the potential solutions that we've identified. And I'll just say that these are not formal designs or even location-specific recommendations at this stage. Really right now, we're brainstorming and trying to identify some big picture ideas that we're considering for the corridor. So I would consider this kind of a menu of options that we can start to refine as part of next steps. Once we hear feedback from all of you and from our stakeholders, our next step then will be to start to refine these and identify some long-term recommendations for specific locations within the corridor. So I'll talk through, I've got 3 more slides here to talk through, and we've split our potential strategies here into 3 different categories. So starting out first with intersection strategies, we've got 4 different ideas here, and we've got some short description and then an example photograph. These are just generic photos that we pulled to kind of give you an idea of what would be involved with these strategies. So I'll start out at the top and talk about lane modifications. So this would be things like adding a brand new right or left turn lane in spots, or potentially an acceleration lane so people can make turning movements and get up to speed as they're trying to join mainline traffic. Left turn staging, this would be another idea that would kind of formalize what's almost already happening in the corridor. We would give a designated location for people to stop in a widened median so they could cross 2 lanes of traffic first, pause, and then accelerate and get up to speed as they're joining mainline traffic. Another idea would be extending the existing 2-way left turn lane that's already in portions of the corridor. Another idea would be looking at different types of intersection control. So we've listed a couple here. Traffic signals would be an idea. So this could be brand new signals at certain intersections. We could also modify existing signals. So we could provide a protected phase for people to take a left turn. So instead of waiting for oncoming traffic to come across, they would be given a protected left turn movement. We can also look at changing some of the timing to allow different time for different turning movements. So that would be one idea. Another idea would be roundabouts. And I know there are a lot of different opinions about roundabouts. They don't make sense in all locations, but where they work, they can be really effective, and they can be especially effective in providing safety benefits. They can also help us reduce travel speeds, but still provide that continuous traffic flow on a highway. Now, on this highway, we would need to look at accommodating multiple lanes, since we do have 2 travel lanes in each direction on US 93. A fourth idea at the bottom is what we're calling reduced conflict intersections. And this is a term that just kind of encompasses some different configurations. We've listed a couple of those that are called restricted crossing U-turn or an R-cut or a continuous green T. And basically both of these ideas would be to try to separate out different turning movements and reduce conflicts. And one way to do that, for example, would be to make an intersection, an approach roadway, a right turn only, right in and right out only, and then provide a designated turnaround location close by where people could take their left turn and go in their intended direction. But again, this would separate it out, that turning movement, and allow people to go where they're intending without having to cross all 4 or 5 lanes of travel at once. So a couple ideas there relating to intersections. Next up, I will talk about our roadway segment strategies. And so these are looking at kind of stretches of roadway. And we've got 4 different ideas here as well. So the first one would be intelligent transportation systems, or ITS. And so this relates to traffic management signs and advanced notices, messaging. We're just trying to enable drivers to be more informed of conditions on the roadway. And that can be used for things like poor weather or poor roadway conditions, curves up ahead. Maybe there's a crash incident that people need to be aware of, or a lot of congestion and traffic backups. There's a lot of different ways we can use this type of information, but it can be really helpful to inform drivers and make sure they're aware of what condition they'll be experiencing up ahead. Another category is roadway features. So we can look at doing things like high friction surfacing, and this actually is something that MDT is already addressing in the S-curves that will be coming up. But we can also do things like roadway lighting, so lighting up the corridor a little bit more to enhance visibility. We can provide different types of pavement markings and signing just to make everything more visible and help drivers be aware of their conditions. We can also look at widening our median. So in a lot of this portion of the corridor, the 2 different directions of travel, northbound and southbound, are right next to each other. And that can feel a little bit uncomfortable and sometimes can be a safety concern. So if we provide a widened median, we can separate out those 2 different directions of travel and hopefully prevent head-on crashes. Another strategy would be looking at extending centerline rumble strips where they don't exist. So I'll talk next about traffic calming. Becca touched on this too, and this actually was one of the recommendations from the separate speed study that has been conducted. And the idea here would be, so Becca mentioned it's hard to get drivers to obey a posted speed limit if you just kind of slap a new sign on the roadway and expect them to change their behavior. What oftentimes is more effective is if we make some changes to the character or the feel of the roadway. And we can do that by things like urban transition zones. Speed feedback signs are the ones that flash at you and tell you how fast you are traveling compared to that posted speed. We can do things like landscaping or different types of pavement markings. All of these ideas would be to try to encourage people to choose to slow down to something that feels comfortable and appropriate for the roadway as it's configured. The last category here I'll touch on this slide is wildlife accommodations. We've heard, again, a lot of comments about wildlife on this roadway, and we know that about 30% of our crashes involve wildlife. So the idea with this set of strategies would be to try to minimize conflicts between wild animals and vehicles. And we can do that in a couple of different ways. There are some shorter term ideas that we can look at. So things like activated signage and detection, that can be really helpful to alert a driver that wildlife is in the area. We can also just improve visibility. So I mentioned lighting in general for in terms of a roadway feature, that can be really helpful to help drivers see wildlife that are crossing the roadway. We can also look at some longer term ideas that might involve grade separated crossings. So in this photograph, we're showing an example up to the north on US 93. You might be familiar, this is near the Evero area, and it's an overcrossing over the highway. That would be one option. Another option would be to look at an undercrossing that goes underneath the highway. So a couple of different options there. With any type of crossing, we would want to fence the highway so that we're keeping animals off most of it, but funneling them to a designated crossing location so they can cross safely away from vehicles. So a couple of different ideas there relating to wildlife. Next up, I will talk about how some of these strategies kind of come together into a corridor-wide strategies. So this would be kind of working more broadly throughout our entire corridor. And we do have 4 different ideas here on this slide as well. So again, starting out at the top, I'll talk about access management. So this would be an idea. And again, a lot of these are really focused on trying to reduce conflicts between different users. And by consolidating approaches and maybe funneling drivers to use a common approach, we can try to reduce the number of conflicts on the highway, the number of entering approach roadways. We might also be able to couple that with some new or different type of intersection control at that consolidated location. Part of that might also involve partial movement accesses. That can be a really effective strategy in reducing conflicts. I've talked a little bit about widening the medians as part of a roadway segment strategy. We could extend that through our entire corridor and look at a divided highway. And that could be concrete barrier rail that already exists in the S-curves portion, or we could look at something else like a high tension cable rail. You might be familiar, there's some of that has been installed in the Billings and Bozeman areas, I believe. So that's one potential idea. Another idea is just a widened median that's vegetated with grass, just a way to separate out those 2 different directions of travel. So I talked earlier about the reduced conflict intersections. Another idea would be to string several of those together and create a reduced conflict highway. And so again, the point here would be to try to minimize conflicts and separate out different turning movements and allow people to travel where they're intending, but not have to cross all 4 or 5 lanes of traffic at once. And then our last idea is something called suburban design. And so this would be taking that traffic calming idea and extending that farther throughout our corridor. So again, here we would be trying to encourage drivers to slow down, to make that choice. And we can do that by kind of changing the character and feel of the corridor. We could introduce more curbing or concrete median, lighting, those flashing speed feedback signs, landscaping, a lot of different ways that we can do that to try to encourage folks to slow down. So that takes us through the potential strategies. Again, this is a very broad menu that we're looking at this point. And our next step will be to start to take these ideas and identify specific locations where we think they make sense in the corridor. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Becca.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for bearing with us. I know that was a lot of information. I want to open it up to questions in just a moment, but before I do so, I'm going to pause on this slide. This is my contact information, my email, and a phone number to call if you have follow-up questions, either after this open house or, of course, in the future. We're always looking for your feedback regarding the study, so feel free to jot those down. I will also be posting this virtual open house recording, as well as the information on these slide decks and information from last night's in-person open house on the project webpage. That's on the Montana Department of Transportation project webpage. So if you want to revisit this information or have a neighbor or colleague that would like to view it, that will be posted, some of it later this week, some of it next week, as soon as possible for you. I also just want to note that the speed study I spoke to from Missoula to Hamilton at the beginning of this presentation is not finalized. They're certainly still open to feedback. So we highly recommend you contact your county commissioners, either Missoula or Ravalli, with any speed study comments, because they would be the ones to connect with on that. And as Sarah said, next steps here are really hearing and gathering your feedback now and in the coming months, and then identifying feasible recommendations to move forward with in 2024. So with that, thank you for your time and thank you for letting us share this information with you. I hope it was helpful. I will mute myself momentarily and we'll move to the question and answer session. Just as a reminder, feel free to pop a question or a piece of feedback into the Q&A chat function, and there's 2 chat bubbles on that one. It's not the one chat speech bubble, it's the double Q&A session, just to clarify. That way we can keep track of who we've answered and not answered. So with that, I will pass it to Katie to help walk us through some of the questions we've received.
Perfect. Thanks, Becca. All right, we have a few queued up for you, Sarah. I'll just start at the top with a great question from Linda. We're seeing quite a few questions about wildlife accommodation, so I think you'll be ready to queue some of those up. So first, Linda's asking regarding wildlife vehicle collisions, excuse me. Has the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Park provided support or recommendations for locating new wildlife crossing structures within the corridor?
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Linda, for that question. Great question. So we are coordinating with resource agencies on this corridor study. We have held one resource agency meeting so far, and we met with representatives from Fish, Wildlife and Parks, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They've given great feedback so far, but we will be continuing that collaboration. We actually have another subconsultant on board, Herrera Environmental, that has been leading the wildlife effort for us. They are helping us understand the specific types of species in the corridor and where they're most likely to cross the highway. And so we'll be sharing a draft report with those resource agencies and then asking for their feedback. We'll also be collaborating with them as we move into the next phase of the study and identify some specific locations where those wildlife accommodations will make sense. So a lot of collaboration happening, and we're just really grateful for their feedback and input on this study.
Thanks, Sarah. That's great. I'm going to go to another one that's somewhat related to that, also from Linda. Linda's wondering if carcass recovery data includes those reported to Fish, Wildlife and Parks for recovery for personal consumption, and if not, do any of the numbers, or she's making a comment that if not, our numbers might be low for wildlife mortality. Do you have anything that you can speak to there?
That is a great question. So from what I understand, MDT's carcass database is compiled from a number of different sources, but ultimately it's what the highway maintenance folks collect on the roadway and then pass that information along to be incorporated in the database. And I guess what I would say is, in general, we think that probably wildlife mortality is likely underreported when it comes to that carcass database. We know that sometimes if there's a strike, an animal strike, that the animal may be kind of pushed off to the side of the road and may not be counted. And as you're pointing out, there might be other situations that are recovered for personal consumption. So we're definitely aware that the carcass database is not a comprehensive tally, I guess I would say, of wild animals that are struck in the corridor. So thanks for that note.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. That's really helpful. Okay, I'm going to go back up to another question from Linda. So you were speaking to some of the crashes that have happened, and specifically in winter conditions. So along those lines, she's noting that black ice along the S-curves is treacherous at high speeds, and therefore she's wondering if there's been any consideration of slowing speed specifically during the winter months. So back to you, Sarah, on that.
Thanks, Katie. And another great question, Linda. So I think we've got a couple of different ways that we can try to address the S-curves. And you're noting that black ice condition. We have definitely heard about that from members of the public, just that section of roadway being pretty treacherous in the wintertime at points in time. And so MDT, I mentioned, is looking at a high friction surfacing for the S-curves. And so that would just help kind of improve the tire grip on the roadway, even when there are adverse roadway conditions. Another opportunity would be the ITS that I had mentioned earlier, that intelligent transportation systems. We might be able to warn drivers of a certain condition up ahead so that they can make a better choice and slow down their vehicle before hitting that condition. And certainly weather conditions or roadway conditions would make a lot of sense for that type of advanced warning.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, next, a question from Sherry. Wondering if the crash data was consistent over each year of the study from 2012 to 2021.
Thanks, Sherry. I guess I would say that each year and, really each week and month and, throughout those years are different. We're seeing different types of crashes. But I might actually ask if Scott could speak to that any further and talk about any trends that we were seeing year by year.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we did, as noted, we did look at 10 years of crash data, so a pretty long history of crash information that we have going back to 2012 and then all the way through the 2021 year. When we look at the data, there's quite a bit of variability, but overall, we have seen a bit of a trend of increasing number of crashes. In general, there was a kind of a lower period of crashes per year, if we just look at the number per year. In 2012, 13, and 14, during those 3 years, we had about, let's say on average, about 85 to 90 crashes per year on this corridor. And then if we look going forward, we've been fairly consistent from about 2015, 2016 going forward, but we saw a pretty big spike where we're seeing about 120 to 130 crashes per year. So kind of summarize, early in the data set, we did have a bit lower crash rate and we saw a bit of a spike around the 2015, 2016 years, and we've been kind of maintaining about the same number of crashes per year since then.
Thanks, Scott. That's really fascinating to know. Next, I have a question from Sherry. She's wondering about the study limits. So noting that the study goes to Buckhouse Bridge in Missoula, and wondering if that's correct from her understanding. And then if so, has any consideration been given to extending Miller Creek Road where significant increase in vehicles use US 93?
Thanks, Sherry. Great question. So you are correct. Our study area extends to the Buckhouse Bridge in Missoula. So that is the northernmost end of our corridor. And I think the decision was really to kind of focus on this portion of the corridor, just south of Missoula down to Florence, and better focus here as opposed to kind of getting into farther into Missoula. I will say, however, that we are collaborating with the Missoula MPO, the Missoula Planning Board, a lot of folks up there just to make sure that our work aligns with the work that they're doing and the studies and the projects that they are pursuing. So we have had a number of conversations with Missoula officials to make sure that our work is in alignment. Joel, I might ask if you'd like to speak to that any further, just in terms of how the limit of the study was set.
I'll be totally honest with you, that was all set before I came into this position, so I was not part of those discussions.
Oh, thanks for that, Joel. Yep.
Okay, thank you both. And Sherry, if there's any further questions on that, feel free to follow up with Becca using that the contact information that she had earlier, and we'd be happy to follow up there. So next, again, kind of back to wildlife, Sarah Morgan, wondering if there were any wildlife accommodations that could fit into corridor-wide strategies.
Thanks, Morgan. And yes, I would definitely say that we are looking at wildlife accommodations throughout the entire corridor. So don't want to imply that it's only in certain spots. I think this will be an ongoing conversation as we continue to work with Herrera and Fish, Wildlife and Parks and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. What we want to do is to try to identify the target species that we're trying to accommodate, and then locate where they're most likely to be crossing. And we do look at the crash and the carcass data, but we also have a lot of additional information that can be provided through those resource agencies. They just have some great knowledge to share with us about wildlife movement and wildlife species in the corridor. So we're really relying on their knowledge and deferring to them to help us understand the locations that are going to make the most sense. The other aspect of this is thinking about the corridor topography. And so when we think about those grade separated crossings, whether that's an overcrossing or an undercrossing, it helps a lot if we have appropriate grades to accommodate that kind of crossing. So that's another aspect that we are considering, and we're doing that evaluation throughout our entire corridor.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, let's see next. This is a little bit more about law enforcement and looking at speeding. So comment was speeding drivers are breaking the law. Have you considered installing speed cameras with hefty fines for speeding, especially in key areas for injury accidents? Seems like that could be an inexpensive option. So thoughts there, Sarah?
Okay, thank you. Yep, great question. And we definitely recognize that speeding is an issue, that there are a number of folks that travel this corridor above the posted speed limit. We also know that law enforcement is out on the corridor. I think all of the times that we've been out there, we do see them. We know that they're doing their very best to enforce the posted speed limit, but of course they are stretched thin and they're doing the best they can with their staffing levels. When it comes to things like speed cameras, that is not something that's pursued in Montana, just generally due, I think, to privacy concerns. We've had some conversations with MDT even just about other types of cameras, and really there are some limitations in what we can do within the state of Montana.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I think that's pretty comprehensive, but certainly if there's anything else, let us know. So again, back to more of the study limits. So circling back to that, wondering from Danica, noting that the speed study did not include a section of US 93 from Glacier Drive to Mormon Creek Road as part of Lolo, and wondering if there was any rationale as to why that area was not included or there's lack of data there.
Thanks, Danica. And you are correct. So the developed portions of Lolo and other communities in that speed study corridor were not evaluated. Again, Becca had mentioned that a different engineering firm had conducted that study. So RPA was not involved in that one, but I do know that the decision was made not to do the speed study in those communities. And I don't know if folks from MDT might be able to speak to that, either Mark or Joel.
Yeah, this is Mark. Again, kind of like Joel had said before, a lot of those limits and things were discussed with others prior to my involvement on this one.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay. So Danica, if you wouldn't mind maybe shooting an email to Becca or giving us a call on that number, or send, I think you can send privately your contact information. We can grab that from you and follow up with the other firm and see if we can get you some more specific answers to that. I apologize we can't now, but we certainly are more than happy to track down what we can. So I'll move on to the next question, just in the interest of time, which is, there were a couple notes just about lighting, and I followed up with those folks privately just to say thanks. We have it noted, and just wanted to make sure that it was made clear for everyone else listening that we have received those comments. And then I'll just read one here kind of along those lines, just from Christine, noting that whenever lighting is installed, that they're hoping that full cutoff or maximum downlighting can be provided. I can move on, or Sarah, if there's anything specific to lighting that you want to note, we can certainly do that now.
Sure, I can jump in just for a second, and thank you for that comment. It's a really good point, and I think with a lot of these different strategies, we're trying to balance different trade-offs. And so recognizing that, as you mentioned, with lighting, it can have an impact, an adverse impact, just in terms of nighttime glare and from an environmental perspective. At the same time, it can provide a benefit to drivers on the roadway. So that's definitely something that we are looking at. We would try to recommend, the most current design, and that's backed up by research in terms of roadway lighting.
Great, thanks, Sarah. That's helpful. Okay, so again, I'm not sure if there's anything specific here, but a question about the specific study limits. I'm just wondering if there are any considerations to impacts on other roads, for example, Blue Mountain Road, when developing proposals for the study.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's an interesting one too, and we definitely are looking at how traffic on the US 93 corridor could affect other roadways. I guess what I would say is our study focus is US 93, but we're thinking about what that means for traffic elsewhere as well. So you had mentioned Blue Mountain Road. that is one of the roadways that we would need to consider. Another one too is Lewis and Clark Drive and Farm Lane. So just with the new Lolo school in terms of how those other approach roadways intersect with the highway and what impacts might occur related to those. And I might pass this one to Scott as well to provide any other input on kind of broader traffic operations in the area.
Yeah, Sarah, I think you kind of covered the high points there. Is that we are focused on Highway 93 operations, but of course how the other streets that intersect with Highway 93, how those impact conditions and making sure that that's safe as well. So regarding Blue Mountain, we're not focused as much on the impacts to the road itself, although the intersection is one of our key intersections that we're looking at. So we'd be looking at conditions at the intersection, how to make improvements there. Certainly we want to understand if we are doing anything negative and having ripple effects to other areas too, but our primary focus is 93, but with the intersecting, the main intersections as well are obviously a key area for us.
Thanks for that follow-up, Scott and Sarah. That's great. All right, next, moving on. Scott, this is just a couple more follow-up on the traffic data. I'm wondering if there was any thoughts as to why that spike occurred around 2015, or if there's anything more in terms of the number of reported crashes from another attendee. So kind of two questions in one there.
Yeah, thanks. No, I don't know that we have anything directly to attribute that, kind of change in crash rates. Looking at the first 3 years of our study area or study data versus the last 7. Regarding traffic volumes, no, we've seen a general slow increase in traffic volumes over the years. So we actually went back and looked kind of 20 years in the past to see kind of how volumes have changed and broke it down into segments. And just looking at the data in front of me right now, if we look at the whole corridor, and obviously there's some different conditions, depending on if you're Lolo, up closer to Missoula, further down south to Florence. But if we kind of look holistically at the whole corridor, we've been seeing increasing traffic volumes by about 0.5% a year over the past 20 years. So kind of a slow, steady increase over the past 20 years. The past 10 years, which would kind of mimic our crash data time period, we've seen a little bit more of a growth, about 0.6% per year, but not the same level of growth that we saw in the crash trends. So the crash trends actually grew at about 5% per year over 10 years. So we did see a little bit of a faster increase in number of crashes than traffic volumes, I would say. So I don't know that there's a direct correlation that we've determined between number of crashes and volumes increasing. But I don't know that I have a good answer for, maybe why crashes have jumped up by, 20%, in a couple year time period there.
Okay, thanks, Scott. All right, let's see here. I'm trying to read and type at the same time, and I should just do one. It's weird to do both. Okay, Sarah, I might turn this one back over to you from James. Wondering if there's any chance of a study being conducted south of Florence or any future of the 93 corridor going further south.
Thanks, James. I guess what I can say is that this study will not be extended. I think we'll maintain the focus just from the portion south of Missoula to Florence. Probably if there's any future study of US 93 to the south, that might be a good question for MDT, and I'm not sure if Mark or Joel might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, at this point, I don't think we have anything specifically on board for that, but Joel may know more about that from the district's
no,
nomination side of things.
there's nothing planned yet for that.
Okay, thanks, Sarah and Mark and Joel. We'll make note of that. Okay, so next back to you, Sarah. There were a couple of comments, William, that we have from you. So I have the comments themselves I have noted and we'll be sure are included. There are a couple of questions associated too, so I'll read just that part of it for you, Sarah. So William's noting if law enforcement administrative tools in the Lolo section might be able to address tailgating, running of red lights or things like that and wondering if there's been any sort of coordination with law enforcement or things like that as part of the recommended strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks, William, for that question. So again, as I mentioned earlier, cameras really aren't an option for us to consider. So those red light traffic cameras are outlawed at the statewide level, and that's based on legislation that's been passed. And I think that dates back to about the 2009 time period. So that is not an option that we are considering for this corridor. We are certainly considering how law enforcement play a role, and just recognizing that speed limit enforcement is a really important part of the equation when we think about speeds in the corridor.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That's really helpful. Let's see, next. Wondering about, again, about some wildlife crossing. So William's asking, he's thinking about wildlife crossing in appropriate locations, and if the study would consider a recommendation for MDT exploring the existing or potential conservation easements, or working potentially with willing landowners for localized land acquisitions to expand those easements to secure highway buffers for habitats near the roadway.
Thanks, William. That's a great question, and I think that absolutely is on the table. One of the things that we've certainly heard from our resource agencies is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to place a wildlife crossing in a spot where we're funneling wildlife onto developed property, of course. So we want to make sure that it makes sense not only in terms of where we place it on the highway itself, but what that land is located on either side. And where we do have conservation easements, where land is going to remain open in perpetuity for wildlife to use, those locations make a lot of sense for crossings. So some of the ideas that you're talking about here are definitely under consideration.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, I think that those are the last of the questions, at least that we have queued up. I'm still responding to a couple of comments, but I think I might just turn it back over to you, Becca, to see if there's anything to wrap up. But certainly, folks, if there are other questions that you have, feel free to add those into the Q&A, and we'll stay on to make sure that we can get them addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And just echoing what Katie said, feel free to pop in any feedback or questions. The project team is certainly here for the next handful of minutes to help answer those. And I will just note and reiterate that all of the questions and comments will be recorded and passed to the holistic project team, so they're made aware. Super appreciate your productive comments and questions. It's really valuable, and every single email we've received and social media comment and comment from these open houses is being taken into consideration as we move forward. So I just want to make sure that that's really clear, and that your time is really appreciated. So we'll hang out here for a couple minutes. Again, feel more than welcome to pop in a question or a piece of feedback, and we'll give everyone a few minutes to do so before we wrap up. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Seeing no other additional questions or feedback. Again, if you have a question the next minute or so, feel free to, oh, there's one. Looks like a piece of feedback from William. Thank you. Katie, just confirming that there's not a question in there that I might be missing.
Correct, and there is another one as well. So we'll respond to both to you, William and Christine, to make sure that those are included.
Fabulous, thanks. And we'll stay on the line here while Katie is making sure those are logged. Again, just noting my email here on the screen. If for some reason something comes to you in the next few days or whenever, frankly, in the next months as the study continues, please feel welcome to email me or call the number on the screen there. And we can certainly log your feedback, get your questions answered. And again, noting that Danica as well, I know you had a speed study question we couldn't answer. Certainly, I will look for your email in the registration information and connect with you, or you're welcome to email me as well. But I made a note of your name. So if you are still on, I will be in touch with you. Other than that, I will give us another minute or so to record feedback, or it looks like there's maybe a question, Katie.
Yep, there is. Thanks, Becca. Again, back to you, Sarah. So wondering if there's a possibility of considering allowing better signage options for businesses throughout the corridor. The attendee is noting that they hear a lot from our clients that it's difficult to find, and their business is difficult to find and dangerous to make a turn onto our driveway. And so wondering if there's any option for increased signage along that corridor.
Thanks for that question. So I guess what I would say is that our corridor study is focused more on the types of regulatory or warning signs that are directed toward drivers so that we can tell them about their requirements in terms of driving on the roadway or upcoming conditions ahead, that sort of thing in terms of warnings. As it relates to business signage, that would be kind of a separate issue that we're not considering with this study. That would be more of a conversation with MDT about placing any signage within their right of way. And Joel or Mark, please feel free to jump in if you'd like to add to that.
No, that's correct. If you wanted additional business signage, it would probably have to go through maintenance and through the channels through them. And that'd be something that they would have to pursue.
Okay, thanks, Joel. And if you want to follow up with Rebecca, we can try to find you the right folks to connect with if that's something that you're looking to explore as well. Let's see here. Okay, another comment that we'll be sure to log. Thank you, Sherry. And then another comment from an anonymous attendee that we will also be sure to track down. So thank you both for those.
Thanks, Katie. I'll let you log those and we'll give everyone another few minutes here to log any last questions or comments. So we'll mute, and again, if you have any last questions or comments, feel free, and we'll wait for another few minutes here. Okay, well, hearing none, thank you all again for your time. Super appreciate you being here on a Thursday afternoon. Again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. We will get this information posted on the webpage. We look forward to connecting with you in the future as we move forward. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the call.